Chapter 1. The Echo of Hooves. Autumn hung golden over Bibracte. Dumnorix guided his stallion through the throng of the great market, and the crowd parted before him like water before a bow. He was young, scarcely 25, and wore the blue and yellow striped cloak of the Aedui with the self-assurance of a man who had known nothing but pride. The bronze clasp on his shoulder caught the afternoon light. From the forge fires the hammers clamored. The scent of roasted boar meat and fresh beer lay in the air, beneath which was the sweeter fragrance of olive oil. Greek traders from Massalia were hawking their jugs, and their dark eyes followed the young nobleman with businesslike interest. A Carthaginian ivory merchant had spread his wares on a blue cloth. Dumnorix's stallion danced as a troop of warriors with freshly sharpened long swords marched past, their blades still dulled by the whetstone. At the edge of the square, a group of bards sang to the lyre. Their voices wove the old stories of heroes who fought against monsters, of kings who became gods. Dumnorix knew every word. It was the music of his childhood, the heartbeat of his people. He reined in his horse as he spotted the druidess. She stood by the horse pens, an old woman with flowing white hair and the coiled bronze armlets that only the consecrated were permitted to wear. Before her knelt a young stallion, strangely still, while she painted the signs of Epona on its forehead with chalk, the goddess of horses, protector of Gallic horsemanship. A merchant from Britain waited beside them, his pouch of tin and gold already in his hand. "She is blessing him for the crossing," an old man standing near Dumnorix murmured appreciatively. "The finest horses in the world, ours. The Britons will pay any price." Dumnorix merely nodded. He knew it. Gallic horses were small and hardy, not as tall as the Iberian breeds, nor as heavy as the Eastern ones. But they were swift, agile, and obedient. A Gallic rider and his horse fought as one entity. No people this side of the Alps mastered the art of riding as the Celts did. He urged his stallion on further, up to the highest point of the oppidum, where the council palace of oak and clay stood. From here he could look over the walls, over thousands of rooftops, over the smoking furnaces of the metal casters, over the broad main street that ran straight south, towards where the province eventually began, of which the Greek traders sometimes spoke, but that was far away. Bibracte was the center of the world, the greatest oppidum in Gaul. He who had not seen it did not know true greatness. Dumnorix breathed in deeply. The wind carried up the sound of the lyres, mixed with the calls of the shepherds on the surrounding hills. It smelled of autumn, of smoke, of horses and freedom. He was young, he was an Aeduan, and the world was perfect. The council chamber smelled of old oak wood and cold hearth smoke. Dumnorix stepped from the sunlight into the twilight of the great hall, his eyes needing a moment to adjust. The elders sat in a semicircle on carved benches, their colorful cloaks reduced in the gloom to mere shades of blue, red, and ochre. At the far end stood his brother. Diviciacus wore the white robe of the Druids, his posture as upright as a statue's. He was only 7 years older than Dumnorix, but the dignity of his office and his journeys to distant lands had etched furrows into his face, making him appear older. In his hand he held not a staff, but a scroll, a Roman custom, Dumnorix thought, and the mere sight of it drove a stab through him. "The news from the east is bad," Diviciacus began without greeting. His voice carried that quiet authority Dumnorix had known and feared since childhood. "The Sequani have invited Ariovist into the land." A murmur went through the circle. Everyone knew that name. Ariovist, the Germanic war king who had crossed the Rhine with his Suebi and now lurked on the borders of the Gallic tribes like a hungry wolf. Germans hissed, an old nobleman named Cotus, on our side of the Rhine. The Sequani took them as mercenaries, Diviciacus continued. They wanted to crush us finally, but now the mercenaries are devouring their masters. Ariovist has entrenched himself in their finest land and demands more. Dumnorix stepped forward. Then let the Sequani reap what they have sown. Their arrogance has blinded them. Why should it concern us? Diviciacus's gaze rested heavily on his brother. Because Ariovist will not be halted. When the Sequani fall, we shall be next. And after us, the Arverni, the Bituriges, all of us. He raised the scroll. I propose we send an embassy to Rome. Silence. The word hung in the air like smoke refusing to clear. Rome. Most of the elders present had heard the name, but it remained something distant, indefinite, a city somewhere far to the south, beyond the mountains, past the Provincia. Some dimly recalled that years ago a Roman general named Fabius had marched through the land and fought the Arverni, but that was long past, nearly forgotten, a story among many. Dumnorix felt his stomach tighten. Rome? He repeated, sharper than he had intended. You want to summon foreigners from the south to keep our neighbors in check? I want allies against an enemy who is superior to us all, Diviciacus replied. His tone was patient, that of a teacher explaining something to a slow pupil. The Romans themselves named Ariovist, friend of the Roman people. They know him, they can negotiate with him, or hold him back. They named him a friend? Dumnorix laughed bitterly. Then they are truly discerning judges of character. A few of the elders smiled faintly, but Diviciacus's expression remained stony. You have never been south, he said quietly. You have not seen their roads, their cities, their legions. Those who make Rome an enemy are lost. Those who make Rome a friend become their slaves. Dumnorix stepped closer, his voice becoming earnest. Listen to me, brother. I have spoken with the Greek traders from the very day they arrived at our market. I have heard accounts of what happened to the tribes in the Provincia. The Salias, the Allobroges, the Arverni, they all negotiated with Rome first. Then they let Rome in. And now they pay Roman taxes, speak the Latin language, and curry favor with the Roman governors. Nothing of their freedom remains but songs that no one sings any longer. Diviciacus was silent for a moment. Then he said, the alternatives are Ariovistus's Germans or the legions. I choose the lesser evil. There is a third option. We ally ourselves with the other tribes as our ancestors did. Together we are strong enough. We do not need masters from beyond the mountains. You live in a dream world, Dumnorix. For the first time, something like sorrow colored Diviciacus's voice. The era of the great tribal confederations is over. Do you not see it? Every tribe fights against every other. We have the Helvetii in the south, the Sequani in the east, and now the Germans everywhere. If we do not find a strong arm to support us now, we shall perish. An elderly nobleman rose laboriously from his bench. Dumnorix had known him since his childhood. Liscus, the chief magistrate of the Aedui, with a voice like crackling parchment. Dumnorix is not without merit, Liscus said slowly. The Romans give nothing for free. What will be the price for their help? Diviciacus hesitated. Everyone saw it. The tiny twitch in his face betrayed that he had feared this question. Grain, he finally said. Winter quarters for the legions, should they come. Rites of passage. Friendship. Friendship, Dumnorix repeated with contempt. Do you know what the Romans call friendship? Amicitia. And it does not mean that one is a friend. It means that one obeys. The council chamber was now utterly still. From outside came only the muffled cries of the shepherds, the clatter of the smith's hammers, the distant melody of a lyre, the sounds of a free people, unaware that their fate was being negotiated. Diviciacus looked around the room. The decision lies with the elders. I have given my counsel. Dumnorix looked at his brother, and for a moment all anger had vanished from his face, replaced by something else, something he had not felt since his childhood, when looking up to his elder brother, a desperate desire to understand. You were there, he said quietly, meant only for Diviciacus's ears. You have seen their world. Why do you trust them? Diviciacus met his gaze, his eyes weary. "Because I have seen their world," he whispered back, "and I'm afraid we have no other choice." Dumnorix turned away and strode out of the hall. Outside, the golden light of the afternoon awaited him, along with the scent of horses, fire, and life. But now he saw everything with different eyes. The market stalls, the laughing warriors, the druidess's sacred rite. It was as though someone had cast a thin veil over the world, under which everything had already become a memory, even before it passed. A word had drilled itself into his thoughts, and it could not be removed. Rome. He knew naught of it, he would come to know. Spring arrived in waves, with warm days and cold nights that froze the breath before one's face. Dumnorix stood on the walls of Bibracte when the messenger arrived. He saw him long before the guards, a solitary figure shuffling up the southern hill, not riding but on foot, staggering like a man who had not slept for days. The morning mist still clung to the valleys, and for a moment the figure within it resembled a spirit rising from the underworld. The guards at the south gate intercepted him. By the time Dumnorix reached the gateway, the man had been placed upon a stone. His cloak was in tatters, the colors of the Helvetia, red and white, barely discernible beneath a crust of dried blood and road dust. A gaping wound stretched across his forehead, rudely bound with a dirty cloth. His eyes were those of a man who had witnessed something that could never be forgotten. "They have come," he gasped. His lips were cracked, his voice little more than a croak. "From the south, thousands, more than I could count." A crowd had gathered around him. Craftsmen let their hammers fall. Market women pressed forward with curiosity, and Dumnorix watched the color drain from their faces as the wounded man spoke. "We wished to move west through the Provincia to new lands, but there they stood, a wall of iron and wood at a place called Genava. Their commander, a gaunt, bald man with eyes like a falcon's, denied us passage. Caesar," someone murmured in the crowd. The name sounded foreign, harsh, as if it did not belong on Gallic tongues. "They built a bridge in a single night, a whole bridge across the Rhone, and then they pursued us. For days, always behind us, always in perfect order, never tiring." The messenger's voice broke, and he began to shiver, although the spring sun was already warming. "And then, at a hill, I can no longer remember its name, they brought us to battle. Our women, our children, our carts, all we possessed was in the plain. And they came up the slope, rank by rank, with shields upon which one could walk, and throwing spears that pierced our shields like parchment." He fell silent. The crowd waited. The wind carried the distant croak of a raven. "How many?" Dumnorix asked softly. The messenger looked at him, and in his eyes lay an expression Dumnorix had never seen before, not the wrath of a defeated warrior, nor the grief of a survivor, but something deeper, something that resembled disbelief at what men could do to one another. "Of the Helvetii? We were nearly 400,000. Elders, women, children, warriors, now." He shook his head. "The bald one has sent them all back to their burned villages, those who still live. He did not defeat us, he erased us. And he said this was only the beginning." Dumnorix turned away. He went to the stable, saddled his stallion himself, for the stable hands did not understand him, and he had no time for explanations, and rode out of the north gate, alone. He rode for 6 hours until he reached the border of the Hédouan tribal territory. Before him lay the valley of the Arar, the river that separated the Hédouis from the Sequani. Beyond it to the east began the woods where Ariovistus's Germans dwelt. It was silent, too silent. And then he saw them. At first, he thought they were the watchfires of a Gallic tribe preparing for an assembly. A familiar sight, irregularly distributed points of light flickering in the twilight. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became that these fires were different. They stood in perfect squares, hundreds of them, each at exactly the same distance from the next. They burned in lines drawn straight through the hilly countryside, as if someone had thrown a glowing net over the landscape. Dumnorix held his horse and stared across. In the fading light of day, he saw tiny figures between the fires, men in uniform armor, marching in groups without running, without shouting, without the wild disorder he knew. Riders patrolled the edge of the camp, but they did not ride like Gauls. Their horses moved at fixed intervals, their lances all raised at the same angle. It was as though he were watching a creature with 1,000 bodies, all obeying a single invisible will. After a while, he felt cold. He did not notice it immediately, but only when the stallion beneath him began to prance restlessly, and he felt his own hands, holding the reins, go numb. So this was it. This was Rome. He did not yet know them. He did not know their language, their gods, or the names of their generals, but he now knew their form. And as he stood there in the cold spring wind, staring down at the glowing network of campfires that had spread across the land like a fishing net over a pond, he truly understood for the first time what his brother had meant and what his brother had not feared enough. The fires flickered. The wind carried no sound across, not even the strike of hammers or the whinny of horses. Only silence, and within it, the eerie sense that something unstoppable had begun. Dumnorix whipped his horse around and galloped back into the night, as if he could escape what he had seen. But he knew it was useless. One could not escape a net that stretched across the entire sky. The rain had set in when Diviciacus returned. Dumnorix watched the embassy ascend the main street from the south gate, 20 riders with drenched cloaks and drooping heads. His brother rode at the front, and even from a distance, Dumnorix recognized the change in his posture. No longer the upright dignity of the druid, but something more bowed, as if he were bearing a weight no one else could see. They met in the council hall, and this time there was no hesitation in the air. The elders were present in full number, and when Diviciacus spoke, his voice no longer sounded like that of a man seeking approval. It sounded like that of a man proclaiming a fait accompli. Rome will protect us. A murmur ran through the ranks, a mixture of relief and concern. Dumnorix stood to the side, his arms folded across his chest, and waited. The proconsul Gaius Julius Caesar has given me his word. The legions will drive out Ariovist and end the Germanic threat. In return, we grant Rome the friendship of the Aedui. What did you promise? Dumnorix's voice cut through the murmur like a blade. Diviciacus hesitated. The rain drummed on the shingle roof, and in the silence between the drops, it seemed the whole world held its breath. Only friendship, he said at last, and grain for the legions. Winter quarters in Bibracte, if necessary, free passage through our territory, support against the Helvetii. Dumnorix laughed, but it was a laugh without joy. Only friendship, only grain, only our gates, only our warriors dying alongside their legions, only everything we have. These are conditions that every ally fulfills, Diviciacus replied, but his voice had grown soft, as if he were ashamed of it. Ally? Dumnorix stepped forward until he stood directly before his brother. An ally says no when the demand is too high. An ally can break the treaty. What you have brought us, brother, is not an alliance. It is a surrender wrapped in pretty words. Lycus, the old judge, rose. The alternative is Ariovistus, or do you want the Germans to do to us what the Helvetii suffered? Dumnorix, we have no choice. There is always a choice. Dumnorix looked around the circle, seeking the eyes of the elders, one by one. It is just that sometimes it is difficult. And sometimes it means that we must fight for our own freedom, rather than sell it to the first person with a large army. You haven't seen their army, Diviciacus said softly. Yes, I have. The words hung in the room, and for the first time Dumnorix saw something like doubt on his brother's face. But it was too late. The vote did not take long. As Lycus counted the voices, the result was clear. Dumnorix left the hall before the final hand was raised. Outside, the rain had eased. The streets of Bibracte were empty, the market deserted, the forge fires under their wet coverings merely smoldering memories of heat. Dumnorix went to the horse paddocks, where in a sheltered corner the old druidess sat silently sorting her herbs. She looked up as he approached, her eyes as old as the hills. "They have done it," he said. The druidess nodded slowly. "That is what they always do." Dumnorix sat beside her on the rain-drenched bench, and for the first time in his life, Bibracte did not feel like the center of the world, but like a trap so skillfully set that the victims mistook it for a throne room. The eagle had been invited in, and it would never leave. Summer burned over Bibracte, and the sky was made of lead. Dumnorix rode at the head of 500 Aeduan horsemen, his long sword heavy in his sweat-slicked hand. Beside him, in perfect formation, marched the legions, an endless snake of iron and leather rolling down the valley like an angry river. The Helvetii had entrenched themselves on a hill, their wagon fort a thorny ring of wood in desperation, and behind it waited the rest. Men, women, children, a whole people fighting for their last scrap of earth. The signal horn of the Romans cut through the muggy air. The battle did not begin, it was unleashed. Dumnorix charged with his riders against the left flank of the wagon fort, while the legionaries advanced in the center like a wall of shields. The stench of blood and horse sweat struck him, mingled with the acrid smoke of burning wagons. A Helvetian warrior threw himself at him, an axe raised high, and Dumnorix's stallion reared up. The hoof struck the man in the chest, and the crunch of bone was lost in the general roar. Dumnorix's sword swept round, catching a second attacker in the neck, and warm blood spattered his face, salty and metallic. Around him, dying horses screamed. The Gallic cavalry stormed and swirled, a wild dance of hooves and blades. But every time Dumnorix lifted his gaze, he saw the same sight, the Roman line advancing relentlessly. No screaming, no chaos. Only the rhythmic clapping of sandals on the blood-soaked ground, the regular flash of short swords, the monotonous advance of a machine made of men. The Helvetii fought like men driven to desperation, for desperate they were. Dumnorix saw a woman lunging at a legionary with a kitchen knife before a pilum pierced her. He saw children hiding beneath overturned carts, their eyes wide and vacant. He saw old men reaching for Roman shields with bare hands, as if they could halt the inevitable. The sun traversed the sky, and the killing continued. By evening, the hill was a carpet of bodies. The wagon fortress still burned, and the smoke hung like a black curtain over the battlefield. Dumnorix sat on his exhausted stallion, his limbs numb, his sword so heavy he could scarcely hold it. The Aedui had won, Rome had won. He rode towards the height where Caesar stood. The proconsul was surrounded by his officers, a gaunt figure in a purple cloak, his eyes coolly sweeping over the field of the dead. He did not smile. He did not speak. He counted. A scribe recorded figures on a wax tablet: prisoners, the fallen, captured livestock, usable wagons. An adjutant reported the estimated legionary losses, and Caesar gave a brief nod, as if hearing a grain price. Dumnorix reined in his horse 20 paces away and stared across. There was no gratitude in that face. No respect for the fallen allies, no recognition of the Aeduan cavalry who had borne the brunt of the flank attack, only calculation. Cold, precise calculation of how many Helvetii remained alive and how many would be needed to repopulate the burned villages that Rome did not wish to occupy itself. Caesar's glance brushed him for a second, a brief, assessing scrutiny, like a merchant appraising a horse, and then moved on. In that moment, Dumnorix understood it fully. Gaul had not won today. Gaul had bled. Gallic horses had died. Gallic warriors lay among the dead. But the victory belonged to Rome. The Aedui had not been partners, nor allies, nor even mercenaries. They had been tools used and cast aside once the work was done. He turned his horse and rode slowly back across the battlefield. Under the hooves, shards and bones crunched. Somewhere a child wept, unable to find its mother. Somewhere a wounded man moaned, with no one to help him. And Dumnorix thought of the words he had hurled at his brother's face in the council hall, back when the world was still whole. He who invites the eagle will never possess his nest alone. He had been right. But being right did not bring the dead horses back to life, nor did it make the taste of ash in his mouth any sweeter. Winter came, and with it came the merchants. Not the Greek traders Dumnorix had known since childhood, those who bargained over olive oil and painted earthenware and adapted themselves to the customs of the tribes, but others, Roman merchants, who spoke Latin and did not ask but dictated. They set up their stalls on the same marketplace where the Druidess had blessed the horses in autumn. But now they did not sell exotic goods. They sold nothing. They bought grain, livestock, hides, wool, and they paid prices that were non-negotiable, because behind them stood the legions, and behind the legions stood the proconsul, and behind the proconsul stood that distant Rome, which was now drawing closer with each passing day. Dumnorix stood at the edge of the market and watched as a Roman tax collector, a small, sweating man with a wax tablet on which neat columns of figures were incised, counted the cattle of a farmer. The farmer, an old man with a weather-beaten face and the bony hands of a life spent in hard labor, stood beside him and said nothing. What could he have said? The tablet spoke the language of the new masters, and in that language there was no word for dissent. 26, said the Roman, closing the tablet. 8 go as tax to the legion, that makes 18, at the fixed price. The farmer nodded silently. Dumnorix saw his hands trembling, but it was not the cold of December that made them shake. It was something else, something new that had spread through Bibracte in the last weeks like mist rising from the ground and dampening everything. Voices, footsteps, hope. He walked on, past the blacksmith's workshops. The hammers still rang, but their rhythm had changed. No longer the resonant blows that shaped long swords, but lighter, more regular knocks, the clinking of plowshares, horseshoes, and nails for Roman barracks. One of the oldest smiths, a man named Bituitus, whose grandfather had forged the ceremonial sword for the king of the Bituriges, stood in the doorway. His arms were soot-stained up to the elbows, and in his eyes burned something Dumnorix had not seen for far too long. "In the past," the smith said, his voice sounding like rusted iron, "we made swords for kings. Do you remember? My grandfather forged the sword of Vercingetorix when he was still a boy and his father visited us. Now—" He jerked his chin towards the plowshares, leaning against the wall behind him. "Now we forge plowshares for Roman taxes, from our own swords. They took our blades and melted them down, and now we plow fields whose yield goes to Rome." Dumnorix remained silent. What could he have said? The smith was right, and being right only made it worse. In the alleys beyond the market, a new word was passed from mouth to mouth, like a contagious disease spread unwillingly: debt slavery. The Roman merchants had begun to extend credit, first only to the elders, then to anyone who owned land. The interest rates sounded low when first heard, almost a friendly offer. But the interest accumulated, and the harvests had been poor that year, because the young men were marching in Caesar's legions instead of behind the plow, and once the debts were there were only 2 ways to pay them: with land or with one's own freedom. Dumnorix watched a man he had known for years, a potter with a workshop near the North Gate, place his debt certificate on a Roman table and receive in return a receipt that made him a tenant on the land that had belonged to him just that morning. The potter signed with a cross because he could not write. The Roman smiled as he rolled up the document. It was a polite smile. That was the worst part, the politeness. No violence, no looting, no burning gate. Just figures on wax tablets, polite phrases in a foreign language, and the unstoppable process by which free men became debtors and debtors became slaves. That same evening, Dumnorix gathered a handful of men in a barn outside the walls. They were not elders, not council members, not men with official titles. They were warriors, young nobles like himself, men who had not yet forgotten what it meant to see a free Gaul in the mirror. They arrived individually, shrouded in cloaks, and spoke softly. "How many tribes would join us?" one asked. "Perhaps the Arverni," said another. "They hate Rome more than we do. And the Carnutes, Their druids say the gods are angered by the Roman temples. Dumnorix listened, and as he did, something grew within him that he had not felt for a long time. It was not exactly hope, it was defiance. The cold, hard defiance of a man who knew he would lose but refused to lose on his knees. "We must hide weapons," he said quietly. "Not in the city, in the woods, in places known only to us. And we need messengers to the other tribes, reliable men who can keep a secret. When the time comes, and it will come, we must be ready." The men nodded. None voiced what they all thought, that it might already be too late. As Dumnorix returned late at night to his house through the empty streets of Bibracte, snow was falling. Large, silent flakes covered the roofs, muffled the streets, and shrouded the whole world in a strange, unreal stillness. He stopped and looked up towards the hill on which the council palace stood. It was dark now, the windows shut, the fires extinguished. In a single year, he thought, this place had been the heart of Gaul. Now it was merely the antechamber to a distant palace in Rome, a place none of them would ever see, and the footsteps echoing in the silence were no longer their own. 5 years had passed since the first Roman trader had opened his wax tablet in the market of Bibracte. 5 summers, 5 autumns, in which the word amicitia, friendship, had transformed into what Dumnorix had always feared it would become, a synonym for obedience. The news reached Bibracte on a rain-swept morning in 55 before Christ, delivered by a Roman messenger who reined in his horse in the middle of the market square, as though the ground beneath his hooves belonged to him. Caesar had issued a decree, short and precise as a sword thrust. Henceforth, no Gallic tribal leader was to wage war, forge alliances, or arm his warriors without Roman permission. What the elders of the Aedui had previously guarded as the remnants of their sovereignty, the right over war and peace, the foundation of every free tribal community, had been annulled with a stroke of the pen. Dumnorix stood beneath the porch of the smithy as the messenger rode past, and he did not read the news on the scroll the man brandished. He read it in the faces of the onlookers, Gallic faces in which horror, anger, and then, as quickly as a dying wick, resignation played out in turn. No one shouted. No one hurled a curse after the messenger. 5 years of Roman friendship had taught the Aedui that shouting changed nothing. He knew they would come. It was only a matter of time. His secret meetings with the Arverni, the hidden armaments in the forests north of the Arar, the messengers he had sent to the Carnutes, someone had spoken perhaps out of fear, perhaps for money, or perhaps because Caesar had long had his own ears in Bibracte. The Romans called it delatio, the art of the secret denunciation, and they mastered it as well as their road building. On the evening of the same day, the elders assembled in the council hall. Diviciacus stood at the head of the room, and as Dumnorix entered, he saw immediately that his brother had wept. The druid's eyes were rimmed red, and his hands, which normally rested calmly on his staff, trembled almost imperceptibly. Before him on the table lay a second scroll, sealed with the eagle of Rome. "Caesar demands your extradition," said Diviciacus. His voice was hollow, as if it were coming from a well. "The proconsul views your actions as hostile acts against Rome. You have secretly gathered warriors and stirred the tribes against the friendship with Rome. That is high treason against the treaties we have sworn." "Treaties that you have sworn," Dumnorix replied calmly. "I have taken no oath to Rome, no free Gaul has." Liscus, the old judge, lowered his head. The other elders stared at their hands, at the floor, at the smoking oil lamps, anywhere, just not at Dumnorix. They had already passed sentence before he entered the room. Diviciacus stepped towards him, gripped his arm, and pulled him to a corner of the hall, out of earshot of the others. His grip was so tight that Dumnorix could feel his brother's knuckles through his sleeve. "Flee," Diviciacus whispered, and his voice broke. "Tonight. I will give you horses, gold, a guide to the Belgae. They have not yet bowed in the north, beyond the great forests. You will be safe there." Dumnorix looked at his brother, This man who had believed he could tame Rome with grain and winter quarters, who had ridden with good intentions towards the abyss, and now stood at the edge, unwilling to jump. "And you?" Dumnorix asked. "Caesar will punish you if I escape. Your friendship with Rome will be worthless. I don't care." Diviciacus's voice was now little more than a whisper. "You are my brother." Dumnorix shook his head slowly. He stepped back, broke his brother's grip, and stood to his full height. The elders looked up, and in that moment he was the proudest man in Bibracte, not because he was stronger than them, but because he was the only one still standing upright. "If I go," he said, his voice carrying through the entire hall, "then the last free Gaul in Bibracte dies. Not in battle, not with a sword in hand, but as a coward fleeing in the night while his people kiss the Roman reins. I stay. Not for Caesar, not for Rome, but so that everyone sitting here today can look in the mirror tomorrow and know there was one who did not grovel." The silence that followed was deeper than anything this hall had ever known. No breath, no scuffing of sandals, no distant echo of smiths' hammers, only the rain drumming on the shingle roof, and beneath it the soft, stifled sobbing of Diviciacus, who had lost his brother before the verdict was even spoken. Dumnorix waited for them to come. The next morning it was not Roman legionaries who led him away, but Hedui, his own countrymen, men with whom he had played as a child, by whose campfires he had sat, and with whom he had fought against the Helvetii. They did not put chains on him. Caesar had ordered that it should appear to be a tribal matter. But they surrounded him as he stepped out of his house, their faces mask-like and rigid. It was Liscus, the old judge, who read out the order. Can one read the face of a man burying his own soul? Dumnorix read it, and what he saw was worse than hate. It was shame, so deep and all-pervading that it could not even rise to tears. The procession led him through the main street of Bibracte, past the market stalls where Greek traders no longer hawked olive oil, but Roman buyers counted the final harvest. Past the forge of Bituitus, who stood in the doorway holding his hammer tight, as if wishing to fling it after the column, and yet did not. Past the horse paddocks where the old Druidess sat, eyes closed, lips moving silently, uttering a final prayer to Epona, the goddess who now protected no one. Dumnorix did not look back, nor did he see the figure of Diviciacus, standing in the shadow of the council palace, watching his brother being led out of the city, into a death that Caesar would later note coldly had occurred while he was fleeing. The reins had fallen. The horse had not reared, had not struck out, it had quietly submitted to the yoke. And as the procession approached the south gate, Dumnorix heard the echo of hoofbeats one last time, distant, faint, and already like a memory, but they no longer galloped, they trotted. In time. They led him through the south gate, out onto the damp plain, where the morning mist still hung in clouds over the grass. Dumnorix walked on foot, his hands bound behind his back, but his head held high. Marching beside him were the Heduan guards, men whose faces he knew and whose eyes avoided his. A Roman officer awaited them with 20 horsemen, not to carry out the execution himself, but to bear witness that it was done. They gave him a horse. A Gaulish horse, tough and small, one of the last of the old breeds before the Romans had shipped the best stallions to Italy. Dumnorix placed his bound hands on the animal's neck and felt the warmth beneath the coat, the familiar tremor of its muscles. The horse snorted and pranced, as if it knew what was to come. "You are to die while fleeing," the officer said in halting Gaulish. "So commands the proconsul. No trial, no sentence, merely an accident." That is, he searched for the word, merciful. Dumnorix laughed. It was not a loud laugh, only a brief, bitter exhalation. Merciful. The victor's word for what they did to the vanquished when they lacked the patience for a proper massacre. He urged the horse forward. Not to flee, he knew he would not cover 10 paces, but because he would not die on his knees. The stallion surged ahead, and for a fleeting moment, no longer than a heartbeat. Dumnorix was once again the young nobleman riding through the golden autumn market of Bibracte, the scent of roasted meat in his nostrils and the lyres of the bards in his ears. He heard the clangor of the smith's hammers, saw the old druidess painting the signs of Epona on the stallion's forehead, and felt the pride of a free people beneath him. Then the first pilum struck him in the shoulder. He held his seat as the horse shied and reared. A second spear pierced his thigh and lodged in the saddle gear. The horse screamed, a high, piercing cry that merged with his own scream of pain, and collapsed. Dumnorix fell with it, and in his descent as the cold Gallic earth rushed up to meet him, a final clear thought formed in his shattering consciousness. The sound of the hooves, it dies with me. Then came silence. The Roman officer rode up, dismounted, and examined the corpse with the indifference of a man ticking off a completed duty. That evening, he dictated the report to Caesar to his scribe, and the proconsul noted it later in his commentary. Cool and precise as everything he wrote, Dumnorix, a Haeduan, who had secretly fomented resistance against Rome, was killed whilst attempting to flee. A troublemaker had been removed. 10 years later, Bibracte was deserted. The walls still stood, but the roofs had collapsed, and the marketplaces were overgrown. The Romans had built a new city a few miles away, Augustodunum, made entirely of stone, with straight streets, a forum and a temple to the deified emperor. The Aedui who lived there now called themselves Roman citizens, and spoke Latin, and their sons served in the legions that had once killed their fathers. On an autumn day, as the wind carried the scent of wet leaves over the hills, an old Gallic farmer sat on the crumbling steps of Bibracte's former council hall. Crouching beside him was a child, a boy with light hair and curious eyes, listening to a story the old man had told 100 times before, yet which no longer wished to be heard. "There was a man," said the farmer, his voice brittle as dry wood, whose name was Dumnorix. He was the last to die free. Not on his knees, not with a Roman lease agreement in his hand, but on a Gallic horse, with the wind in his hair. He was the last who still knew what our hoofbeats sounded like when they still belonged to us. The child did not fully understand, but he nodded, because the old man smiled sadly. The echo of the hoofbeats had not faded. It was just no longer Gallic. Decades later. The rider checked his horse on the ridge of the hill and looked down at the ruins of Bibracte. He was a Roman citizen, bore the name Lucius, and served in the Ala Gallorum, the Gallic cavalry unit of the 6th Legion. His trousers were cut in the Gallic fashion, tight-fitting and blue-striped, and at his side hung a long sword forged by a smith in Avaricum after the old pattern. He spoke Latin with his officers and Gallic with his horse. Below him, in the plain, lay the crumbling walls of the Oppidum. Moss overgrew the stones, and where the great market once stood, gorse now flourished. No smoke rose, no hammers boomed, no lyres sounded. Only the wind swept through the tall grass, making a sound that was almost like whispering. Lucius knew little about this place. His grandfather had sometimes told of a city that had stood here, but the memory had faded, washed away by Roman tax lists and Latin prayers. What mattered was the present. He was a rider of Rome, the best in his squadron, and in 3 days' time he would march east to fight the Parthians. Gallic horses, Gallic riders, Gallic swords, all in Rome's service. He urged the stallion forward and rode on, without looking back. The echo of the hooves had not faded. It was simply no longer Gallic.